sign days for it. I vanished from the face of the earth. That means I failed.
What calls? Don't say things like that. Things like that are terrible.
What?
Don't say things like that.
Why?
Because it'll make us feel bad about failing you.
Farley, better not fail me.
I don't want to feel bad. I want to feel
Don't
good.
fail me.
Am I even on your comp board? I don't know.
Yes, you are.
Am I?
I'm literally a security major.
All right, so I think we should get
Non-confirmation.
started here. We do have some people at home. So for those who are at home, thank you for joining us. Any questions you might have or anything else, please go ahead and ask them in the Q&A. I plan here to go for about half an hour to 40 minutes, but that leaves plenty of time for questions and answer, both from people within the class, but also from people at home. This is a multimedia. It's not just UK, but there are some UK people, there's some Patterson people, and some general public type people. For anybody who's struggling with audio, we're doing the best we can. We have an owl, and so hopefully the owl will take us through, will get us to where we need to be. But thank you for joining both those of you who are here and those of you who are at home from University of Kentucky elsewhere. So very briefly, most people know me here. My name is Farley. I went to Ukraine, and that's what our talk today is going to be about. It's going to be about the trip to Ukraine. And I want to thank Professor McGrath for the graciously allowing us this time in what would be her class time that I am essentially hijacking to take over and to give this public talk. All right, so to get started, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and do the PowerPoint presentation thing. And this is not a particularly detailed PowerPoint, but I think it will give some sense of where we're going and what we're talking about today. All right, so I went to Ukraine. The genesis for the trip was a conversation that I had with a friend of mine, a long-term friend of mine, former student, Matthew Gus, who is currently with the Center for International Policy, but has been with several different think tanks and other organizations over the years, the last 2 decades, and most notably was part of Bernie Sanders' foreign policy team from 2017, I want to say, until about 2022. His family is ethnically Ukrainian. He had been planning to go for a while, and then when he decided he finally wanted to go, he invited me. And so we went under the auspices of the CIP, but especially in my case, with financial assistance from the University of Kentucky. So UK did pay part of that. And you can see here that there were immediate dividends for the investment by Kentucky, because KFC sprang up all over Ukraine as soon as I arrived. But this is kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting from the point of view of Kentuckians, because we don't think of ourselves as being a particularly international people. But one of the really interesting bits when I got there and I started asking Ukrainians the question, what American states can you name? That almost always the answers were California, New York, Texas, Kentucky. That those are the 4 states that were the first 4. Many of them could name more than those, but those were often among the first 4 that they could name. Usually Florida was there to round out the top 5. Now, could they actually identify Kentucky on a map or explain even in the vaguest terms where Kentucky was in the continental United States? Well, that's a different question, and the answer is usually no. But they were familiar with Kentucky, not just because of KFC, but also because of the bourbon and the horse racing and the other things that make Kentucky an international space. And so this right here was taken in Kyiv on the first day that we arrived, right after a very long train ride, which we'll talk about in a second. But this is right outside the main train station in Ukraine, and in Kyiv. And even though we had planned to the entire time, we did not actually pick up a bucket of chicken to eat on any of the long train rides. It was one of the most disappointing aspects of the trip, was not being able to sample Ukrainian Kentucky Fried Chicken. But anyway, private-public partnership here for actually taking us to Ukraine. What about the travel? Well, it was about 10 days all told. So I left on September 11th and then returned on September 21st. Of those, 5 nights were spent on a vehicle of some sort. And so that included one night on a plane, so the red eye from Dulles to Brussels, and then 4 nights on trains. And the worst of those by far was the 19-hour train ride from Warsaw to Kyiv. And the fact that that came on the immediate tail end of the red eye from the United States made it particularly unpleasant. 3 of the 4 trains that we were on were quite pleasant and comfortable. The first train, the 19-hour trip from Warsaw to Kyiv, had all of the comforts that one would expect of the best Soviet service circa 1965. And so as comfortable as you might expect that it would be, but whatever, we survived. In the end, we were able to survive. 2 observations to start off with, and a lot of this talk is going to be observational rather than policy oriented, right? So it's going to be, what did we go to Ukraine and what did we see? What did we experience that shapes then how we think about the conflict, right? So 2 things that are notable right away from just this travel experience. The first is that Ukraine is a very large country. Right. It doesn't necessarily look as large as it should on a map because it's right next to Russia, and Russia is the biggest country in the world. Ukraine obviously is not as large as the United States, but then most people these days don't get around the United States in trains, right? And so it's surprising when you get on board a train and your destination is 19 hours away. You can take train rides like that in the United States, but of course people prefer to take planes in any kind of trip like that. But you can't take planes in Ukraine. Why can't you take planes in Ukraine? Because they might be shot down, right? Because airfields and airports might be attacked, right? And so simply the way you are getting around the country, right, the way that you are evolving yourself and actually doing the observation here is structured by the war. That in a previous time when there was peace, you would not normally take a train from Kyiv to Odessa. You would not normally take a train from Warsaw to Kyiv. You would take a plane, right? And that might take 2 hours, but now you have to take a train. And that has changed how Ukrainians have to live their lives, right? Their lives have changed because of this war in very basic, fundamental ways. Now, the other interesting thing, especially about this very first trip, this very first leg of the trip, were the other people who were on the train with me, right? And so what kind of people, what is the demographic that is going from Warsaw to Kyiv in September, 22 months into the war? And the answer here was interesting, right? Right next to us were some Orthodox Jews, right? American Orthodox Jews who were going because of, I forget the name of the city, but it's a particular shrine that's very important to the Orthodox Jewish community. And there was a large gathering of Orthodox Jews in this place, and they were going to it in the middle of the war, right? It did not change their religious obligation, and so they continued to go to that. It was part of the high holidays. But most of the rest of the people, and this surprised me, were young women and children. Right? The train car we were on had plenty of women in their 20s and 30s, and those women had children. And they weren't primarily men. And we asked, why was this, right? Where do these people come from? Why are they trying? And the answer we got in the end was these are women who are returning to their families and their homes in Kyiv. They may have returned last summer as well. As the winter comes on, as the weather changes, many of them will return to Poland. But Kyiv is now safe enough that, especially when the threat of Russian airstrikes is limited, these people feel that they can return to Kyiv. They can take care of their cats. They can take care of their apartments. They can change out their wardrobes. One thing they can't do is they can't bring their men with them, right? Because the ability of men to leave Ukraine, men really of any kind, anything approaching military age, so something like 18 to, I can't remember the exact upper limit of it, they can't leave Ukraine. right? They are restricted to being in Ukraine, even if they're not being immediately conscripted into the Ukrainian army, right? So a lot of this transfer going back and forth between Warsaw and Kyiv is really people who, it's primarily women and children, and they are going back and forth between living as refugees in Poland and living their lives in Kyiv or in other parts of Ukraine. But it was one of our first indications that social life and a civil life was really continuing in Ukraine, even during the war, right? Even as the war continued to have an effect on life, but that you still did have this civil um, social life. Now, the other thing I'll note about this is that even though the train was a really unpleasant, right, that first time, it was on time. That it was not a minute off on its stops all the way across, and that was also true of the train we took to Odessa and back from Odessa, and the train that we took from Kyiv back to Warsaw at the end. Right, the train system there really functions in a way that the American train system, unfortunately, does not function almost at all. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But travel is part of the war, right? Sort of what's going on here has affected how people move between cities, how people engage in civil society, how people are really engaging with the United States. So that took us to Kyiv. And so the first night, as you would expect, is mainly just recovering from travel. I think we arrived around 6 o'clock. We went and ate at a Ukrainian fast food place. The name of it escapes me right now, but it has Ukrainian fast food. And what that means is exactly what it sounds like. Lots of borscht, lots of pierogies, a whole bunch of stuff with basically meat stuffed in pastries. People called it the McDonald's of Ukraine. I thought it was a lot better than that, especially because it was a buffet. And so you were able to order basically, anything you want, pile it on this giant thing. Things that we noticed about Kyiv right away, right? So this is made on, this is the square where in 2014 there were the demonstrations that toppled the pro-Russian government. And those flags right there are for essentially set up. There's one flag for every Ukrainian who's been killed in the war so far. Now, how exact is that? I don't know. And there aren't really good metrics for casualties on either the Ukrainian or the Russian side. But we know it's many, many thousands. So many thousands of Ukrainians are dying in this war. And so that's one of the things you notice about Ukraine, about Kyiv, right? That Kyiv is a capital city that is at war. And because it's a capital city that's at war, that's not all that far away from the front, you see the signs of conflict, right? The signs of conflict are lots of recruiting posters, are lots of tables and desks where people are trying to do more recruiting, where the army is trying to do additional recruiting. And there are lots of men with guns. So whether these are demobilized soldiers in some cases, or essentially barracks duty soldiers, there are lots of men who wander around, and some women, because the police force is something we noticed. The police forces were more female than you would expect, and I think that's largely because the men are at the front. But there are lots of people with weapons wandering around the city. Now, the city itself is still quite alive. And this was, I don't know exactly that I knew what to expect with respect to this when I showed up, and when we showed up in Ukraine. But the city itself is still quite lively. Odessa, I'll talk about in a second, is probably a little bit more lively, but Kyiv is still very lively, right? There are no shortages that we could see in any of the stores. There are no shortages in restaurants. There's really very little economic indication that the war is causing any sort of significant economic problems for civil society, for civil life in Ukraine at this point. You wander around the city and there are young people wandering around the city with you. There are people pushing baby carriages. The subways, the metro is full of people. There aren't very many Americans, right? So there's not a lot of English speaking, and a lot of times what you actually have to do is translation, right? So many of the people we had to speak with, certainly more than you would have experienced in Western Europe or even in Eastern Europe, does require translation. But there are lots and lots of young people, and they are out in the evenings, they are out in the days. And they are essentially living through the war, right? They're continuing to live their lives as the war goes on. And that was kind of surprising too, right? I was surprised at how many military-aged men you would still see in Ukraine driving cabs, being waiters, and so forth. And apparently this has a little bit to do with Ukraine's strategy of conscription, which is focused on men who are older in the age distribution that is still eligible for military service, out of hopes that the younger men would still be around and able to have children in the future. Right? So it's a very specific demographic strategy. We talked to a lot of people in Kyiv, and a lot of people who were very interesting. One group of people that we talked to were a group of young Ukrainian socialists. These were people who had very left-wing political attitudes and skepticism to some extent of the Ukrainian government. And the questions they asked were very straightforward. It's like, why do socialists in the United States not support this war when it's so evident that justice is on our side? There was a young man from Belarus who had left Minsk because it became politically uncomfortable and had moved to Kyiv, and he asked the same kind of questions, right? What's wrong with the American, the German, the Western European defense industry, the military-industrial complex, that they can't produce for us the kinds of weapons that we need in order to win this war? And so those were very interesting conversations we had, and it was very interesting coming from this American perspective, where the politics of Ukraine have obviously grown more complicated, to find in Ukraine this degree of ideological solidarity around continuing the war effort. We also got lots and lots of questions, and this was true in Kiev, but also in Odessa, about the 2024 election. So there were a lot of people who in Ukraine who very much viewed the 2024 election as being critical to Ukraine's war effort, right? There is not a lot of trust for former President Trump in the Ukrainian society. There's not a lot of expectation that former President Trump will continue the war. There were some nuanced arguments that we heard from time to time. Arguments essentially that Trump was not likely to allow Ukraine to expire immediately after he became president. But those are complicated arguments, and mostly people were asking, well, how much of a chance is there that Trump will be reelected in 2024, and how much of a chance is there that he'll be able to sever US support for Ukraine? And the answer we were able to give was, we don't know, right? It's American politics. It's hard to say, right? No, hard to predict he was going to be president in the first place, right? And so obviously hard to predict what's going to happen in 2024. Now, in terms of specific things related to the war effort that we saw in Kyiv, we were able to visit the Georgian Legion, which is a group of Georgian-led and primarily around 75% Georgian volunteers who have served in Ukraine since 2014. I know some of you have seen this photo right here of the Ukrainian wolf and the Georgian wolf. This is a flag devouring the Russian bear. And people said, that's very metal, and it is, and I wish I could get it on a t-shirt, but we weren't able to. These are people who've been fighting Russia for quite some time. They were fighting Russia in Georgia before 2014. Some of them actually had experience in Chechnya, fighting against the Russians. Now, not only do they continue to fight Russia but they also do a lot of training of Ukrainian territorial forces. Like I said, it's primarily, but not entirely Georgian. It also has the character of an international brigade, but everybody who joins up has to have military experience, right? So it's not simply yahoos who can go and join the Georgian Legion. Those people can go and join the Ukrainian armed forces where they get a little bit of training, but the Georgian Legion was very much people who have military experience who will be able to continue fighting. Jasmine, it looks like you're raising your.
No.
Okay. One of the most interesting bits of speaking with the people in the Georgian Legion was that they were trying out some of those little scooters that you see all over campus, the little two-wheel scooters, but these were combat-ready scooters. So they had much larger tires, much greater carrying capacity, and a much larger range. And they were investigating whether those could be used in a combat capacity. Yes.
How is this, like the Georgian Legion, affecting Russia's relationship or treatment towards them right now?
So, I mean, that's a good question. And the Georgians we spoke to identified Georgia's political future as being very much linked to Ukraine's political future, which I think was probably overstating it a little bit. These were Georgians who had left Georgia so that they could go and continue to fight Russia. Now, the current existing Georgian government is broadly tolerant of Russia and Russian influence in the area. And so, with respect to how this affects Russia's treatment of Georgia, I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. But these are definitely people who were very committed to the idea that the future of Georgia was predicated upon the ability to push Russia out of Ukraine, and that would influence Russia's approach to Georgia. And so I think that in a large part, it was people who are skeptical of Georgia's ability to fight Russia who wanted to be able to fight Russia in other places. So the war effort is evident and is visible, even in places like Kyiv. But I want to caution people, you could go to Kyiv right now and you're not going to see burning buildings, right? You're not going to see buildings that have been blown away by cruise missiles or bombs or artillery. Now, one reason you're not going to see those places is because Kyiv's air defenses are really, really good. And I'm sure the people have heard about Ukraine's alarm system. And I would play it right now, but when you download it on your phone, you basically get alerts all the time about Russian airstrikes on Ukraine. And if you have your settings right, it's Mark Hamill that gives you those warnings. And so it's essentially, go to your air raid shelter right now, and then the air raid is over. May the force be with you, blah, blah, blah. Right. But it rings all the time if you have it on your phone. So I finally took it off my phone because I got really upset about it. But the damage is not still being done largely to Kyiv, especially because of the air defenses on the one hand. And on the other hand, the Ukrainians have rebuilt, right? So you go there, and one of the things that strikes you is how modern and viable the city feels because there are huge construction cranes. Right? People are building new buildings in Kyiv, new apartment buildings, new office buildings, right? So the city does not feel like it's on the edge of collapse. It feels like people are building out a future there. Now, this is 22 months into the war, right? It's 22 months, roughly, I guess 20 months into the war. And so a lot of the people we talked to talked a lot about stuff that has happened in the past. One thing that I noticed that I thought was a little bit off, but that became more evident when I had some conversations, there are a lot of people who have dogs, but almost all the dogs are small. Right, that there were not many large dogs. And I asked somebody about this, and the answer to why people don't have large dogs is because small dogs are easier to put on a train and to get away with if you have to flee. And there was one person in particular that I spoke to who talked about her dog, and that in the months after, really in the weeks after the initial Russian invasion, she had left Kyiv because she had a large dog that had knee problems. And the dog was really uncomfortable walking down the steps into the train stations and the subway stations where people had to take cover. right? And so she left Kyiv and she moved to Lviv because there were fewer airstrikes until her dog passed away. And then when her dog passed away, she moved back to her apartment in Kyiv. And that was something that I noticed in several places, right? That there were plenty of dogs, there were plenty of indications that life was going on. But things were slightly different, right? They were slightly off because people were adjusting to the reality of being in a wartime setting where cruise missiles really do explode near you if they don't get shot down by patriots. I had the opportunity while we were there to talk to a dean from Kharkiv National University. Some of you probably know that, and some other faculty members as well. Some of you probably know that Ukraine's higher educational system was world renowned. It was world class before the war started. And in that sense that there were lots of people from especially South Asia and Africa who studied in, did graduate and undergraduate study in Ukraine. That system is, if not irretrievably broken at this point, under severe damage. And it really depends on where you are. But the experience that was described to me about Kharkiv National University is that the university itself came under artillery bombardment, has been under artillery bombardment at times. That meant that essentially experiments were shut down, research labs were shut down, climate control was shut down for sensitive instruments, for all kinds of biology, chemistry, physics. And so essentially years of research on the part of faculty were lost. And that's not even starting with the faculty members who, on the one hand, went and joined the army, or on the other hand, have left Ukraine. And one of the things that the West has done in an effort to be helpful, and people were willing to acknowledge that it was helpful to a point, was to make space for Ukrainian refugees in the West, right? And one of the things the universities in particular have done is to make Ukrainian refugees who were academics home at places in the West. But what this dean was talking to me, we actually were doing a Zoom call while I was in Kyiv, he was in Munich. He's like, I'm really happy to be in Munich, but somebody has to go back to Ukraine at some point, right? We need to reestablish this university system at some point, and we need to be able to attract students back to it at some point, because we need Ukrainian professors teaching Ukrainian people. And while the problems that afflicted Kharkiv National University and a lot of the other universities near the front are a little bit different than the things you would see in Kyiv or Lviv or Odessa. And I did visit a college campus in Kyiv, and it felt exactly like a college campus, except that I couldn't get on it because it was actually gated. But had all sorts of young people wandering around and doing young people things. But if faculty can't return or have no incentive to return to the parts of Ukraine that have been damaged by the war, that's a major problem looking forward, right? And so it was one of these areas in which a lot of Ukrainians said, look, we're really happy that you're helping us out in this way, but there's a poison pill aspect to the way that you're helping us, right? And so making space for our young, productive people outside Ukraine is not actually necessarily ideal for the future of Ukraine. Anyway, so while we were in Kyiv, we also had the opportunity, well, one, we had the opportunity to take the Kyiv's subway station, and the subway in Kyiv, I can't remember exactly what it's called. It's not called the subway, but the metro. It reminds you a lot of the DC metro, if the DC metro functioned appropriately. But all the escalators were really fast. Everything was clean. The trains were really fast, and perhaps notably, the stations were really, really deep. And so for people who are familiar with the DC Metro, like everything was like DuPont, right? In terms of people in DC, DuPont, Adams Morgan, these are very deep stations. All of the stations in Ukraine or in Kyiv were very, very deep, which is a legacy of the Soviet period when the system was constructed, right? It was constructed in part to be a bomb shelter, and that's what people used in some way for during the period where Ukraine, or when Kyiv was under prolonged bombardment from Russians, that it became a space in which people could harbor themselves and to be safe. While we were in Kyiv, we had the chance to speak with an American diplomat at the U.S. Embassy. Now, these were always background conversations, you can't tell. But for those of you who have any experience with FSOs, you expect a tremendous degree of professionalism, and that's exactly what we got. Just about any question we asked, he would give a very long answer, extremely detailed answer. And who are we, right? We're yahoos. We're not official government representatives, but nevertheless, it was an extremely productive visit to the U.S. Embassy. We then met with a Ukrainian diplomat who talked a lot about the challenges of Ukrainian diplomacy, both public diplomacy and normal private diplomacy. One thing in particular that we talked about was how do you reach out to the developing world? And from Ukraine's perspective, this is a anti-imperial war, right? The Ukrainians feel about this conflict as being an anti-colonial conflict, right? In the sense that anti-colonial struggles were waged in Africa and Asia and elsewhere, right? The perspective they have on Russia is of a occupying colonial power. Now, I want to come back to that when we talk about Odessa, because attitudes towards Russia are complicated. But this diplomat also said that it was almost impossible to get people from South Asia, from Africa, from other areas where you have a sensitivity towards post-colonial politics to buy into that narrative, right? It was very difficult for diplomats and people from those areas to think about Ukraine as being a victim of colonialism, right? Of this being a post-colonial conflict. Because for people from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, right, when they identify imperialism, colonialism, they identify it with the British and the French. And the British and the French are staunchly pro-Ukrainian in this case. And they identify Russia as historically being an anti-imperial power because of longstanding Russian connections, longstanding Soviet connections with resistance in those areas. And so trying to describe Ukraine's war as an anti-colonial, post-colonial conflict grated in the wrong way upon a lot of the people who they were trying to talk to. And that was a very interesting perspective. Hadn't really occurred to me, since it seems obvious to me that Ukraine is a victim of Russian imperialism. But those particular words, colonialism, imperialism, don't work on the international stage in the way that they might work in the United States or the way that they might work in Europe. And that was really, really interesting. We visited Yar, which was there was a massive massacre of Jews in World War II. In Kiev, the architecture in Kyiv is really interesting because there's a lot of hyper-modern stuff. There's also a lot of stuff that goes back before World War II. There's stuff that goes back to Imperial Russia. And so architecturally, it's a very interesting place. We were told repeatedly, and it's something I believe, that the city had experienced, in effect, a artistic and cultural renaissance after 2014. Right? So there's graffiti everywhere, and it's good graffiti in Kyiv, right? It's really sort of artistic, people who know what they're doing, people who have spent a lot of time essentially painting every wall that you can find to paint. And we asked, so where did this come from? Well, it's all post-2014, right? Not post-2022 necessarily, but post-2014. Right, and there was a different understanding of what democracy meant in Ukraine after 2014 than there had been before, so after Maidan. And that was something that was true of both Odessa and Ukraine. But let me move and Kyiv. But let me move on to Odessa here, because Odessa was very, very interesting. So here's a few things from Odessa. So again, full night's train ride, but this one was a lot more comfortable than it had been before. And then we arrived here. So you can Odessa at the end of that, right there. Patterson School, right there. Always have to wear the make the case for Patterson. So for those of you who don't know, and I wish I put this up on a map, Odessa is on the Black Sea, Right, so it's very far south of Kyiv, and I think the train ride was around 12 or 13 hours rather than 19, but it was still a long train ride. And it's a much different city than Kyiv, right, as you kind of would expect from being in a different region of the country. Architecturally, it is a much older city than Kyiv. So Odessa was not, unlike many cities in Ukraine, was not destroyed in World War I, was not destroyed in the Russian Civil War, was not destroyed in World War II. And so much of the architecture that dates all the way back to the 19th century is still there. Right? Those buildings are still there and are still in use in a way that they're not in other parts of Odessa is a port city. Odessa has a reputation for being a port city in ways that are both good and bad. Right? So Odessa had a reputation before the war for being really the center of Ukrainian organized crime. And that's interesting because we'll come back to that in a second. But Odessa is also a gorgeous city. Right? The architecture is fascinating, right? Because it's a port city, it has hosted Greek communities and Italian communities and Russian communities and Turkish communities and Jewish communities. And all of these communities have left a cultural and architectural imprint on the city. Right? And that is still visible, even though Odessa has come under more concerted air attack than even Kyiv. Now, one of the places that we really wanted to see, that I really wanted to see, were the Odessa Steps. Does anybody have any idea, like, this cultural significance of the Odessa Steps? Anyway, it's one of the most famous films of all time. Was Battleship Potemkin, has one of the most famous film scenes of all time, which is a baby carriage rolling down the steps of Odessa. Unfortunately, you can't go to the Odessa Steps right now because that's where the Russians shoot their missiles. So there are lots of granaries and dockyards, and that's where the Russians still consistently bombard the city. And the air defenses in Odessa are not as good as the air defenses in Kyiv, and so sometimes the missiles get through. And in fact, we saw one of our hosts' favorite Italian restaurants, which had been destroyed by a Russian hypersonic missile. It's like, why would the Russians destroy an Italian restaurant with a hypersonic missile? And the answer is, well, we don't know that. We're not sure that's what they were aiming for, but that is what they hit, and that's what they destroyed. But still, there's not a ton of pattern. So Odessa, has this aspect of being a provincial city, right? So there is not the presence of the federal government, of the central Ukrainian government in the same way in Odessa as there is in Kyiv. And one of the interesting takeaways from that is that a lot of the war effort in Odessa is actually more about civil society and the way that civil society is engaging with the conflict than it is about how the federal government is managing the war. And so, and I'll move here to the state society part. The hosts that we had in Odessa were all civil society figures, right? Some of them were civil society figures in terms of being business leaders. Some of them were civil society figures in terms of being leaders of non-governmental organizations. A few of them did work for the Odessa municipality, but every conversation we had was about, this is how my business has been restructured by this war. This is how what I do on a daily basis has been affected by the conflict. And this is how I have rebuilt my business around the support for particular units on the front. And so we had, for example, this fellow right here, we call him Dimitri One. Dimitri One is the most famous perfumer in Odessa and apparently in the entire Black Sea, right? So he's more than just a Odessa figure, he's a more famous figure. And we went to his perfume shop and we got perfume, and I gave Dr. Montgomery some if you want to go and test it. And he has restructured a lot of his business towards making combat capable blankets, right? Blankets that are intended to protect all the way down to -30 centigrade for people at the front, and to making medical evacuation bags. And so the profits and also some of the structure of his business are now built around serving the war effort. And he has relationships with specific Ukrainian units that are at the front. where he supplies those specific units. There was another person that we talked to who was, and this is obviously supposed to be more than just a foot right there, but who had redesigned her fashion and textile business around producing combat underwear. Now, combat underwear, like how important is combat underwear? Well, actually, it's pretty important, right? And so there were innovations in terms of creating kinds of underwear that were easy to manipulate in the context of somebody being wounded in the battle, right? So basically Velcro underwear. So you didn't have to move somebody's lower limbs in order to take off their underwear if they were wounded. And now that was her entire business, was dedicated towards supplying Ukrainian units at the front. And this was interesting in context of Ukraine, whose central institutions have often been, people are skeptical of those centralized institutions, of the central government institutions in Ukraine. And so it was very interesting that we did have this experience of a state and society that was supporting the war effort on its own, right, rather than being directed. We had good conversations with NGOs that handled refugee issues, NGOs that handled orphan issues, and these are largely internally displaced refugees. And so how are those refugees taken care of? The other interesting thing about Odessa is that the city parties. And so we got there, around 10 a.m. We went and did a whole bunch of stuff over the course of the day. And then I kind of wanted to lay down and take a nap. So we were as I returned to the hotel, I noticed that they were turning the lobby into a nightclub. And I don't mean like the kind of hotel lobby that is supposed to be turned into a nightclub. I mean like a typical Radisson lobby that looks like the lobby at a Radisson was being turned into a nightclub. And they started doing sound checks around 4, and by 5:30, when my nap ended, not because I wanted it to end, but because it had to end, it was full on oons, 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 oons. You go down, there are lots of sketchy Slavic men, there are lots of women wearing leopard print. That's like 5:30, right? The nightlife began at like 5 o'clock, in part because there's a curfew, right? There's a curfew at 10. And so rather than change their partying ways, they just bumped up the party by like 3 hours. And the party started then, and that was at the Radisson, of all places. Wander out, and the entire streets are alive with people, right? People are wandering, you have young people, you have old people, people are drinking beer. It's really sort of a fascinating experience for a country that is at war, right? And the country that's in a serious war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, right? But the civil society of the city remained quite vibrant despite all of that. And this was particularly interesting right here, evocative in some ways, I thought. So myself and my friend Matt, this is Dimitri too, by the way, we get back to the area we're supposed to be in around 10 o'clock. We just missed last call. We wandered into a bar and asked if they'll serve us anyway, and they say no. Right? Because what do you mean? So Dimitri too then stops us and starts talking to us about his friend who will continue to serve us beer if we go down to his friend's bar. And so we ask where, and he says, well, you go down there and you turn it right and just tell him Dimitri sent you. Like, okay, I can do that, right? But we're looking down there. He says, never mind, I'll walk you there, right? So he walks us there. And it's very evident that the bar owner had had this experience with Dimitri before, right? Where he just brings randos to the bar after hours. But whatever, he serves us not only a beer, but a shot as well. Dimitri at this point becomes very expansive in his talking and knocks my beer onto the floor where it breaks. This was also clearly an experience that the bar owner had before. But then Dimitri starts talking to us and he realizes we're Americans, right? And he asks us, I don't understand why people at the front are not giving me more credit for the stuff that I do in Odessa. And we're like, okay, let's bite. What do you do in Odessa? I put on a beer festival. All right, that's terrific. I'm going to let you make peace with your God and your country about whether that beer festival is sufficient. But maintaining the normality of Ukrainian life was one of the things that was very interesting about this, right? And how many people remained absolutely committed to ensuring the continued normality of Ukrainian life in a situation, in a context which was very distinctly not normal. Right? How do you make it feel normal when it is absolutely not normal? Now, the other interesting thing about Odessa, and I want to go into this sort of briefly, is that organized crime in Odessa has collapsed. Right? There was a huge report on this that came out literally the day that we arrived in Odessa, and I bought it from my phone. Oh, here's a big new report on Odessa and organized crime. Since that organized crime has collapsed in Odessa, and this was confirmed by an anti-corruption activist that we spoke to when we got back to Kyiv, is because so much Ukrainian organized crime and organized corruption is driven and has historically been driven by Russia. And she referred to it, the anti-corruption activist referred to it as strategic corruption, right? That all the way back to 1992 and even earlier, it has been part of Russia's political strategy to ensure that Ukrainian institutions are as corrupt as they possibly can be. And that this center, this hive of Ukrainian organized crime in Odessa had essentially withered on the vine over the past 20 months because the connections between Odessa and Russia had effectively been severed. So even more interesting because Odessa was thought to be one of the cities in Ukraine that was going to be most receptive to Russia. It's primarily a Russian-speaking city. When we got there, we talked to a lot of people, and they would say, like, look, I still think in Russian, but I speak in Ukrainian now. Right? And so that was a change that was very much happening right, at the time. It's a change which I think is not limited to Odessa, but it's part of others, that even the people who grew up with Russian language are, in response to this war, changing that approach. And the other thing that we talked about and that was made evident to us, and it probably shouldn't be surprising, but came out more in Odessa than it had in Kyiv, the sense of betrayal at the hands of Russia was palpable. Right? So these were people who had friends in Russia, they had relations in Russia. Nobody thought that this was going to happen. Right? Before February 24th, 2022, nobody in Ukraine thought that this war was going to happen, or at least that it was going to happen in the way that it happened. Right? And even on the day of, people talked about their experiences where Russian missiles were literally landing in Odessa and Russian troops were driving on Odessa because Russians were very successful in the south in the first days of the war. And so it looked like they might be able to grab Odessa, where people simply wouldn't believe that the Russians were advancing. Right? Russian tanks were dozens of miles away and approaching Odessa, and people simply wouldn't believe because they didn't believe that Russia would do such a thing. And then it became evident that actually, no, Russia would do such a thing. And in terms of how that affects sort of the long-term capacity for Ukraine to make peace, we'll talk about that in a second. But the level and the feeling of betrayal and really hostility towards Russia as a civilization is palpable. And it was even somehow more palpable in Odessa than it was in Kyiv. I want to speak a little bit about something that almost didn't come up at all, and that is Volodymyr Zelensky. I don't know if you would be surprised by this. I was a little bit surprised by this. There is no cult of personality in Ukraine around President Zelensky. I think I saw one picture of Zelensky, and that was on a t-shirt in a shop that obviously catered to tourists. There are none of the hallmarks that one normally associates with the development of a cult of personality around a particular leader. And so it's very interesting to us. We obviously wanted to ask about that. And more than one person, right? Several people. So people had obviously been talking about it in this way. People talked about Zelensky very much, and they made the explicit connection to Winston Churchill. Because on the one hand, there was a great deal of honor and esteem for the role that Zelensky had played as a war leader. Right? And in particular, the role that he played in the first few days of the war when he did not flee Kyiv, when he was given the opportunity. but there was at the same time people willing to make but as soon as the war is over, we will need a new that we are a democracy, we are the author of what happens to us, and we do not believe, and several people said this, we don't believe that Zelensky is really the person who can lead Ukrainian reconstruction. We don't think that Zelensky is the person who's going to be able to lead Ukraine in the peace that's going to follow this war. And that struck me as very interesting and a really healthy attitude towards democracy, a surprisingly healthy attitude towards democracy. That there was this esteem for Zelensky as the war leader, but there was also the belief that once this is over, it's not going to be Zelensky anymore. Right? We're going to elect somebody else. Now, the issue of elections in Ukraine is really, really complicated, and the way it was phrased was, rule number one of elections in Ukraine is we don't talk about elections in Ukraine because it gets really, really complicated really, really fast if you're trying to figure out who gets to vote and where they get to vote. And so we could talk a little bit about that in the Q&A, but there's not a lot of appetite for near-term elections in Ukraine, but there is the belief that as soon as the war is over, we'll need a new president, right? And that new president is going to be somebody who's not Zelensky, and that person's going to lead us into the peace. Speaking of the peace, there is, from anybody we spoke to, now we had a curated group of people, right? So it wasn't a random collection of Ukrainian citizens that we talked to. It wasn't Ukrainians in the western part of the country. It wasn't Ukrainians near the front, right? Ukrainians in these two cities, one of which was regarded as pro-Russian, the other one, which was Kyiv. Nobody we spoke to had even the faintest enthusiasm for peace. No one wanted peace. Everyone we spoke to, including the young socialists and the civil society leaders and the business leaders and random people on the train, no peace, right? They wanted to push the Russians out of the country. And when we say push the Russians out of the country, push the Russians out of the entire country. The closest that we had to anybody who would even breathe the idea of a negotiated settlement was a woman who said, well, as long as you have Odessa, why do you need Crimea, right? Odessa is this beautiful place on the beach. Why do we need to worry that much? But then she walked that back very quickly and said, of course, we'll need to reconquer Crimea. But there is no enthusiasm for peace among the people we spoke to. The relationship with Russia, again, feels to me to be fundamentally broken. Right? That it's not this question of just distrusting Putin or distrusting the Russian government. There is a remarkable hostility towards the idea of Russia. Not only the idea of Russia, but everything that is substantiated in the lives of everyday Russians. Right? There is this sense of deep betrayal that the Russians have conducted here, and that has permanently damaged the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Couple times we brought up this, well, sometimes people in the West feel like the United States is willing to fight all the way until the life of the last Ukrainian. People we talked to were like, okay, that'll work. That's good enough for us, right? If you want to keep fighting and keep supplying us until we run out of Ukrainians, then that's fine. We'll run out of Ukrainians eventually. But it did not bother them, the idea that the United States was waging a proxy war that was dependent upon their lives. They were like, yeah, American stuff and our lives, we'll kill some Russians for you. They were comfortable with that, even enthusiastic about that. I like this picture. This was from a brunch place. But you'll notice about this picture here that there's one country missing, right? It seems like a lot of Ukrainians like to think about the future, right? They like to think about the future with this big part of the map not there.
But no Crimea.
Yeah, I guess you can't see. Yeah, well, I think that's it. Crimea right there. It's hard to see.
No,
Yeah, I
it's
think
on the right corner. It should be on the right corner.
here's Ukraine right here. I think that's Crimea right there. It's hard to tell when there's no Russia, right? It makes the whole map weird, but this is how a lot of people like to think about it, right? It's how the Georgians wanted to talk about it. It's how Ukrainians wanted to talk about it. we'll end this war when there's no more Russia. And now what that means is they'll end this war in the hopes that Russia will break up or the Russian government will collapse or something along those lines. But there is extraordinary antipathy towards the Russian Federation. Stuff, and it's already gone on too long, but you have to take questions afterwards. The war is there, but Ukraine does not feel like a country that is exhausted. Right? It doesn't feel economically exhausted. It doesn't feel exhausted in terms of the ability to put people in the streets. It feels like Ukrainians have a lot left in the tank, right? Economically and demographically. Now, we saw two really big cities, right? We did not see Ukrainian countryside where Ukraine has undergone the same kind of demographic crisis that Russia has undergone. Ukraine has had a severe refugee problem, right? Something along the lines of 15% of its population being either internally or externally refugees. We saw some of that, but it was not the central fact of Ukrainian life. The Ukrainian economy really felt to us like it was still purely functional. There were people in shops, there were people in restaurants. In classic European fashion, if you guys have been to a European city on a Friday night, you know the difference between a European city and an American city is that people dress well, right? That you don't see people in Europe wearing hoodies on a Friday night. Well, you don't see that in Ukraine either. Right? You see people dressed well on Friday night and Saturday night in Ukraine. And that suggests that there's still something left in the tank. Right? That suggests that there's a lot of Ukrainian civil society and the Ukrainian economy that remains perfectly functional at this point in the war and hasn't really damaged that part of Ukrainian society. With respect to the broader war, it's hard to say, right? With respect to the impact of the war on Ukrainian society, almost everybody seems to say, like, look, it's made us less corrupt. It's made the central government more receptive and more responsive. It's reduced crime. It has produced a cultural renaissance, right? Even larger than the one that happened in 2014. And at this point, from the people we talk to, there's not an appetite for negotiations, right? There's not a push for negotiations. There's not an appetite for negotiations. There's a lot of worry, but the worry is about the United States. The worry is about the United States and what's going to happen in the United States in 2024. Right? That's the biggest concern that Ukrainians were willing to speak with us about, was what is the attitude of the United States going to be moving into the future. So with that, I'm going to stop my share here. And I am be happy to answer any questions from either people who are here or people who are online. So if you see, for those of you who are online, you can see the Q&A and just go ahead and ask any question you might want in the Q&A. I will do my very best to be able to answer it. But for people here, do you guys have any questions? Raymond?
You had a translator, correct?
We did, right? And so that was one of the biggest expenses and one of the biggest, sort of barriers to just anybody being able to go to Ukraine and have the same kind of experience, is that you kind of do have to have a translator.
Was it Ukrainian translator?
It was a Ukrainian translator, but I mean, it was people who spoke both Ukrainian and Russian, right? Which a lot of people there do,
Yeah.
right? But not a lot of people speak English. And so in restaurants and lots of other contexts, right, there was a lot of pointing at things on the menu, right, in the hopes of getting something rather than actually knowing what stuff was. But there was this self-conscious Westernization. In Odessa, it was very interesting. In Odessa, we were almost dragged to a McDonald's, right? Because our guide was like, well, you have to go to a McDonald's in Ukraine. And I generally make it a policy to go to McDonald's in every country I visit, just because I think it's cool. But she's like, this is the very best sandwich that you will ever have in McDonald's. It is the Ukrainian sandwich, right? And so we went to the Ukrainian McDonald's, which was absolutely full, right? Just like long lines, everybody there, kids. No.
No?
It actually was, it was perfectly adequate. It was like a quarter pounder with a different kind of bun.
Wasn't better than the one than any you've had in the US?
It was not the most shockingly effective McDonald's sandwich. I mean, I don't know, right? I would have to compare it to all of the other McDonald's. It was not a McRib, right? Given the choice between the
Yeah.
Ukrainian sandwich and a McRib, I would not hesitate to take the McRib.
It's too bad you didn't go to KFC.
Right.
There's
It
a
is too bad we didn't go to KFC.
in Morocco, and they tell you not to go there. Because they stay away from watching restaurants. You'll get sick.
All right, so this is a question for Kevin. Were you able to get a feel for the display and competence of the Georgian force? So yeah, we were. I mean, they seemed professional. They seemed hardcore. They had a very sophisticated layout to the base where they were able to do training, and they were training some Ukrainian territorial units there. And the Ukrainian territorial units were interesting because it was half women. Which is part of Ukrainian territorial forces, not necessarily represented in Ukrainian frontline forces. But yeah, they seemed exceptionally professional. So that was very interesting. They were also, as you expect, not particularly interested in negotiations or peace with the Russians. They were dismissive of Americans. Interestingly enough, the Georgians were. They said that Americans are fine until it gets to be minus 30 centigrade in the trenches, and then Americans prefer to have beds. And so it was hard to keep Americans in the force. But they also talked about how they had a unit of Japanese troops. They had a Latin American unit, or I guess it was more of a Hispanic unit because it involved some Spaniards as well. That was essentially a Spanish-speaking unit. So it was a multinational unit, but they seemed absolutely committed, absolutely dedicated. Questions about the visit?
You go to War Museum in Kyiv?
Did not get a chance to go to the War Museum in Kyiv. We didn't have a chance. We were supposed to go to a museum in Odessa, but there was just so much stuff that it was difficult to make time to get to everything. So we were not able to go to a museum in either place. Now, we were able to go to some of the big, I guess we did go, was it St. Sophia? One of the big cathedrals in Ukraine, or in Kyiv. And outside of it, they have a long line of broken Russian military vehicles, right? So all stuff that was blown up at some point, and then essentially are trophies in the square. These burned out Russian tanks and artillery pieces and infantry fighting vehicles. But we weren't able to get into, we did not have time to go and do a lot of other stuff in terms of museum stuff. Question from Keith. Hear much, especially from people with friends or family in the military or from current or recent members of the military, how well or ill the military was being run from an ordinary soldier's perspective. So, what about the recent dismissals of recent military officials for corruption? So, the Minister of Defense was dismissed just before we got to Ukraine, and his entire staff was dismissed while we were at lunch with a Ukrainian army spokesman. And so she was like looking in her front, oh, my boss just got fired. Which actually later in the day led to her being suspended. That, you know, a whole bunch of stuff came out of that. So there was a lot of open acknowledgement that there was corruption in the armed forces. But most of the corruption in the armed forces, the way people talked about it, there was some discussion of corruption in the supply chain of getting especially food and clothing to the armed forces. There was not a lot of complaint about the officer class or sort of the senior leadership of the army being incompetent or bad or anything else. There, generally speaking, there was a fair amount of faith, but there was concern about corruption with respect to getting not advanced military equipment, but sort of the equipment to sustain the army to frontline units, which is, you know, I think part of the reason why in Odessa, so much of that was taken up by civil society. The bigger issue was in recruitment, right? That there was sort of a well-known scandal that had developed around the problem of corruption in the recruitment corps, where essentially people were paying off recruiters to be excluded from conscription. And that was one of the central things that led to the dismissal of the Minister of Defense, and then also to the dismissal of large parts of his staff, was questions about corruption in the recruiting. And generally speaking, it was interesting, right? Because people were like, well, the previous minister was not personally corrupt, but he oversaw a lot of people who were personally corrupt. And so that was a major problem. So there was definitely discussion of it, but it wasn't so far in terms of challenging the actual leadership of the Ukrainian armed forces. Did you get a feeling that the US or any Western country was a true ally, a hesitant partner that had to be dragged along, or a third party to be exploited to the needs? So I'm going to answer this from the point of view of what we got from Ukrainians and how they were thinking about it. Most Ukrainians tended, and maybe they were just telling us this because we were Americans, because that's what we are, we're Americans. People thought that America was a true friend, right? That Ukraine and America were true friends. I mean, people in Ukraine, the people we talked to, they identified American and Ukrainian interests as identical, right? They said, and there was every indication that they believed that this was a civilizational war that was being fought in Ukraine between Russia and the West. And so the fact that it was in Ukraine was unfortunate for Ukrainians, but it was part of a broader struggle. And that the US was party to that struggle, right? And so I would say of these three, it's really as a true ally. Now, there clearly was some sense that, yeah, sometimes the United States had to be dragged along, but the United States has, generated a lot of goodwill in its performance in the week before the war. And Biden has generated a lot of goodwill in terms of being viewed as a true friend of Ukraine, in terms of the amount of equipment and the amount of support. And that support, and I think this is important too, because it's connected to how healthy the Ukrainian economy feels for Ukrainians right now, even when macro indicators say there's a dire experience. But a lot of that is because of US and Western European economic support. And so, yeah, I didn't get the sense that Ukrainians felt that we were somebody who had to be dragged into it, or that we were somebody that were being exploited. They really did feel like there was a true partnership between Ukrainians and Americans.
What about the delays in the weapons getting there, debating every weapon system?
So every Ukrainian is going to tell you that, and they told us this repeatedly, right, that the only problem with the United States is they're not giving us weapons fast enough, right? That they need to give us more weapons, they need to give us weapons faster. Any sort of complaint that Americans have about, well, F-16s are complicated and you can't just learn to use them in an afternoon, was brushed aside by Ukrainians saying, you have to understand that Ukrainians are smart and know how to fight Russians, and we can figure out how to use the F-16, no problem. So there was definitely that kind of attitude that the Americans need to send stuff faster. But for example, with the Georgian Legion, we asked them, what do you need? What would be beneficial to you? And what do you think, sort of more broadly, that Ukraine needs in terms of equipment? And his answer was, well, I mean, the stuff that you've given us so far that's mattered has been HIMARS, right? Because it's really disrupted Russian logistics, and cluster munitions, right? Cluster munitions are absolutely critical in terms of forestalling further Russian offensive activity. He wanted more cluster munitions. He wanted more HIMARS and more cluster munitions, right? And the cluster munitions he wanted were something very specific that were essentially, I think, 120 millimeter mortar cluster munitions. And he's like, this is what we need. And when we asked, it's like, okay, well, aren't cluster munitions kind of a problem? Everybody we talked to was, okay, you have to understand that dropping cluster munitions in Ukraine is like littering in a junkyard. That was the exact phrase. That the Russians have already dropped so many cluster munitions on this country, in addition to planting an entire crop of landmines across the entire country, that this concern you have that civilians are going to go and pick up American cluster munitions, yeah, okay, maybe that will happen in 20 years and that's going to be tragic. But there's a 10 to 15 to 50 times greater chance that they're going to pick up an unexploded Russian cluster munitions, because the Russians have been blanketing the country with this stuff, right? And so complaints that that cluster munitions are going to disrupt the environment or whatever else were not taken very seriously by the Ukrainians. We didn't ask them about depleted uranium, but I suspect that they would have given the same answer. Did you say this was the first? Yes, this was my first time in Ukraine. I had never been to Ukraine. I'd never even been to Poland before. And so, yes, it was quite a bit different. Other questions from the?
It's funny, it's kind of like a little sad that people still, their view of Zelensky is not like as popular as it is here.
I wasn't sad, I was interested, right? I thought it was a very healthy approach to democracy, right? But you remember Zelensky, his approval ratings were like 20% when the war started. You know, he was elected, and people mention this, right? He was elected to do two things: end corruption and make peace with Russia. And it turned out that both of those things were beyond his capabilities, right? Now, he has turned out to be very effective in this other role, but the people had not really they had not let that overturn or overrun their previous attitudes towards Zelensky, right? And so
people I spoke to saw him as kind of a clown, like that hurt his feelings, his comedian,
well,
like a populist.
and one of the people we talked to was like, you know, that's actually part of his appeal. That's why he's good at this particular thing, right? He's an entertainer, right? He's an entertainer and a PR guy. And that actually happens to work to what Ukraine needs at this particular moment, is somebody to be on the international stage and be able to do PR. David asks, what were Ukrainian perceptions of the summer offensive? Ukrainians were touchy about the summer offensive. You know, while we were there, this was middle of September, and so it was very evident at that point that the summer offensive was not as successful as a lot of people had wanted it to be, or a lot of people had hoped it would be. But talking about that made the Ukrainians pretty touchy, right? They felt like they were being rushed. They felt like we weren't talking about their successes in the way we needed to. And this was from the perspective of September. They were very much of the attitude toward that, you know, we've done the hard work, we've penetrated the Russian lines, and so it's going to be easier from here on out. Now, as it has happened, that hasn't really been the case, right? It hasn't gotten easier. That we haven't really had a breakthrough in a way that a lot of them had hoped, and the Russians have even begun some offensive operations in some sectors of the line. But what I will say was there was I mean, you could argue that Ukrainians were being unrealistic with respect to expectations of what the offensive might have generated, and they were defensive about the offensive, right? They were defensive about the degree of success that it had seen, but they were also quite aware of what was going on at the front, right? And everybody seemed to know and seemed to have like all of these towns and villages that were being taken or being fought over. So even though, and this was one of the complaints about the previous Minister of Defense as well, even though you do have censorship about stuff that goes on in the front in Ukraine, you still had people who were pretty knowledgeable about what events looked like. So, so at least when we were there, there was still optimism and hope and a degree of defensiveness about the summer offensive. Any other questions from anybody here? Oh, did you encounter any Ukrainians who had a different opinion on the war than the popular consensus? So, I mean, be straightforward, no one that we talked to. But again, you know, we are we talked to, I mean, the Ukrainian government and the US government, right, did not have any effect on the people that we talked to, right? We talked to US government employees, we talked to Ukrainian government employees, but it was not a junket that was paid for by the Ukrainians or the American government. Still, you know, the people we talked to were not necessarily fully representative of the Ukrainian public. But no, I mean, we didn't encounter any Ukrainians who had the slightest bit of sympathy for the Russians or empathy for the Russians, or even an inkling that there should be peace. And, you know, if we went to a different part of the country, if we talked to a different segment of Ukrainian society, that might end up a lot different. But the people we talked to, absolutely not, right? There was just no one we talked to had any interest in peace with Russia. Anything else? Okay, then, well, I want to thank everyone who joined us online. I want to thank all of the Patterson students who joined us here in class. I want to thank Professor McGrath for allowing me to take over part of her class today to talk about Ukrainian stuff. I would suggest to everybody that Ukraine is a fun place to visit, right? I wouldn't do it necessarily in a war again, unless you really want to do war tourism. But it's a very interesting country. Kyiv is a fun place. Odessa is a fun place. And I very much look forward to visiting Ukraine again after the war is over. Thank you so much. How to go to Chernobyl next time? Well, it's Zaporizhia. We were supposed to go to Zaporizhia. That was initially one of the locations we were supposed to go to, but it fell through. And probably it's good that it fell through because I would have probably not had to be entirely truthful with the University of Kentucky if I had ended up in Zaporizhia. Yeah. So, but fortunately, I was able to be truthful with the University of Kentucky about all of this.
The Blackbears just announced they're ending support team, right?
What's that?
Blackbears.